Delighted guests, I should start off by responding to that wonderful introduction where you listed some of my successes, but perhaps I should start with my failures. When I was a child, my aspiration was not to be Cabinet Secretary or head of the Civil Service or a member of the House of Lords. It was to be a professional footballer. I had all that was necessary for that apart from talent, which was a problem. Aspirations that are somewhat out of line with our abilities seems to run in my family because my daughter, at the age of from 6 to 9, her aspiration was to be, when she grew up, a mermaid. I had to find a way to try and get her away from that, and I'm pleased to say she's now at university studying politics, history, and economics, although she says the economics is very boring. So I'm obviously not succeeding there. But I'm delighted to be here. I have traveled around Africa quite a lot, but never been to Ghana. And I have to say that was my mistake. This morning, when we were recording on television and radio, I was given a nice Akwaaba. I did not know what Akwaaba meant, but it was very positive, so I was delighted by that. And I'm glad to be here. My life started lecturing in economics, and I can assure you that the one thing, having reviewed the comparative economic statistics between Britain and Ghana, I looked at the level of our public sector debt, our deficits, and our growth rates, comparing the UK with Ghana. Ghana outperforms the UK on all of those measures. So you will not be getting an economics lecture from me tonight. I will instead concentrate on what we've learned over the centuries from our mistakes as well as our successes in the area of politics, democracy, and elections. I should start with when I joined the civil service back in 1979 from lecturing. We had just had an election and Margaret Thatcher had been elected Prime Minister. And as a new civil servant, I was taught right from the start about the values of the civil service. They are honesty, objectivity, integrity, and impartiality. And that impartiality is what allows the British civil service to work for whoever the people vote for. So we stay permanently through those transitions between governments, whoever has been elected. So I was interested to see a transition take place. In fact, I had to wait a long time. It wasn't until 1997 that the first transition took place, when the Conservatives changed and Labour won. Tony Blair won that election in 1997. So it's not that we've had an enormous number of transitions. And because there have been a very long period with Conservatives in power, when Labour came in, they were suspicious that the civil service had been somewhat politicised by working under one government for a very long time. Fortunately, I think we were able to dispel those suspicions quite quickly. And in fact, the new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, came to work with very many of the same civil servants who had been working happily for a Conservative government. So that worked very smoothly. Again, the success of the Labour government meant that it wasn't until 2010 that we had a change from that Labour government. And again, when we moved to this time a coalition government, there was a certain sense of suspicion that perhaps we'd been politicised this time by the Labour government. And again, I'm pleased to say that when I had conversations with the Prime Minister, for example, about his private office, the officials working closest to him, what he wanted was to keep the same officials, keep those civil servants. They demonstrated not just impartiality, but their professionalism and their ability to help him carry out his duties as Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister's duties in what was for us a very new role as Deputy Prime Minister. So that period taught me that trust is very important, that you must maintain the trust of all parties if you are to have this civil service that can see through transitions and be there and help to ensure that transitions can take place at pace, so you can introduce real pace and be able to work with the new government, whatever that government might be. So the plan of what I'm going to talk about tonight and there will be a written text which will be handed out and made available. But I want to try and keep this story alive for you, so I won't be reading from any written text. First of all, I want to describe what we do in the UK for normal transitions, the preparations we make, how we prepare for a general election. Secondly, I want to come on to the actual election of 2010, which is quite a gripping story. Not as gripping as your last election, I have to say. Thank goodness, because I think living in boring times is quite good. But ours was quite exciting, somewhat unexpected, and led to some unique problems for the civil service and for the political parties. And then at the end, to draw on some lessons for this. And I stress that in this, I come to talk to you about the UK experience, but I should also, and I hope you realize this, want to learn from you. I come here for a very new democracy. You're learning things very quickly. You've gone through fair and open elections viewed internationally as a great beacon for the world. And you have something that I would, and the British politicians would give their eye teeth for, which is the turnouts that you get at your elections. We have not been able, possibly people are taking democracy for granted in the UK. I would love for us in our next general election to have a turnout that was as high as the ones that you are getting in your elections. So you are managing to create a vibrant democracy, and I hope we can learn some lessons in the UK as to how to do that. So let me start with the normal preparations in the UK. Most governments in the past would last for around 4 years. It was up to the incumbent Prime Minister to choose the date of the election. So obviously they would try and choose a date when they thought they would win. Go after 4 years, but occasionally if they felt that they wouldn't win, then they would extend the period to the full 5 years. And so we had to be ready. Prime Ministers would allow the civil service to talk to the opposition parties, and they would tend to do this with a 4-year election. They would do it from the January, so we had the period from the January through to the May to work out our talks with the opposition. When there's a 5-year election, it goes on much longer, and it did certainly for the 2010 period. The new coalition government have moved to the system you have, which is fixed-term parliaments, but they've chosen to go for 5 years, so we know that barring accidents, the next election in the UK will be on the 7th of May 2015. So we'll get to a more regular process of time between being allowed to, the civil servants being allowed to talk to the opposition and the actual election taking place. During those talks, it's common for the civil service to be in listening mode. So the opposition parties will explain to us the kinds of policies they want to implement if they were to win, and we listen to them. We can ask questions and say, well, you know, clarify that. Do you think that's legal? Those sorts of questions. How much do you think that will cost? But it's not for us to improve their policies or give them policy advice at that point. So we're listening in order that we can do the second normal task, which is to prepare briefing packs for all possible eventualities. So we've always prepared briefing packs for the two main parties, Conservatives and Labour. In the 2010 election, we put a lot more time into preparing a briefing pack for an incoming Liberal Democrat party. It was very unlikely, given the opinion polls, that they would have be a single party in government, but we knew that if they were part of a government, we need to understand their policy priorities. So in a normal circumstance, we do all of those things. We prepare for the opposition, we prepare these briefs. And this history of impartiality of the civil service is something that is accepted, but it's only really come into law and legislation in the UK very recently. This is an example where the civil service and our government didn't exactly cover ourselves in glory with respect to pace. There was a report telling us to do this, and that report was written by Northcote and Trevelyan in 1853. And as the chairman said, we measure ourselves in centuries in the UK. It was a century and a half before we actually got the legislation through, putting into law the impartiality of the civil service. So it's there now. So those were all the normal preparations for an election. Come 2010, I was Cabinet Secretary at this time, and I've been Cabinet Secretary for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and we were approaching the election. And the issue for us was, would this be a normal election? And I was worried. First of all, it was a year 5, so there were the increased chances of there being a transition. Secondly, the opinion polls were showing something quite unusual, that there wouldn't be a clear majority. In our system, a first-past-the-post electoral system, we tend to get a clear majority either of one of the big parties, Labour or Conservatives. It looked like this might not happen. And thirdly, as I mentioned at the start, it had been a long time since we'd had a transition. So people of my generation who'd been in the civil service for over 30 years hadn't had actually many experiences of real transitions of government. So everyone was rusty. The civil service was rusty. Our media and our politicians and our electorates were all uncertain about what would happen if there were an unclear election. And what I decided to do was make some preparations. The Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, had asked me to look at some work that had been going on in a faraway country. You can't get further away from the UK than New Zealand. And they developed some very clever ideas, and they put them in the form of a cabinet manual, which codified the rules and guidance for various outcomes. And it had looked at and specified the conventions and rules governing hung parliaments when there wasn't a clear result. And basically, I visited New Zealand, and I talked to them about it, and we stole their ideas with pride. I'll be clear about that. And I prepared a draft chapter, the chapter of this cabinet manual dealing with elections, and I put it before Parliament, got the Prime Minister's approval, put it before Parliament, and Parliament discussed it. And I also talked to all the academic commentators, the professors of constitutional law, all the important people who would be, if there were an unclear Parliament, the media would go to say, please interpret for us. We don't want the politicians telling us what's going on. Tell us as an independent academic what should happen. You know, should the Prime Minister stand down if he hasn't got the most seats? Answer, no. It's the Prime Minister can wait and see, and eventually, if it turns out that he is not going to be the person who can command the confidence of the House of Commons, he will recommend to the Sovereign, our Queen, that she calls on someone else to do that. Hopefully by then, the political parties will have sorted out a situation where they will know who that should be. So we prepared that, and we prepared a debate, much as you are now preparing a debate. And the whole point of this was to try to get agreement to the rules and conventions that would apply in advance of the hurly-burly of an election. In our system, an election period lasts about 3.5 weeks. So this was in advance of that. Now, the guidance that we put out before the 2010 election was only in draft form, but it allowed that debate to take place. It allowed a consensus to emerge, and those academics gave their advice on television. And so there weren't debates and controversies about what should happen. There were just interest in how the political parties would play it. And that was the second part that I needed to prepare my civil service for was, okay, let's imagine, let's role play this. And we did various scenarios. And one of the scenarios was an election that was unclear, and we had people playing the roles of the different leaders of the parties. And we said, well, what's going to happen? And we gave them the manifestos of the parties, asked them to negotiate with each other, and come up with what we hoped would be a clue for us as to what the answers might be. What kinds of parties might come together? Might it be to a big party with a small party, or a big party with lots of smaller parties? So we tried all this, and one of the scenarios was scenario 4, which actually turned out to be pretty much exactly the result that we got. And so we went through this. Being good civil servants, we stuck to our brief. And our negotiating briefs were based on the manifestos. And I am ashamed to say that because we stuck very rigidly to that, we didn't have room for compromise in the way that real politicians can make political trade-offs. So as civil servants, when we actually had that scenario, we failed to come to agreement. As the chairman of this session, I just said, okay, let's stop there, and we'll all keep our fingers crossed that if that happens, someone will be able to find a way through. It was quite worrying. So we did the role playing. And to my horror, let's fast forward now to the election night. To my horror, when the exit polls came up, they were exactly along the lines of scenario 4. Now, the media were actually saying the exit polls were probably wrong. And my experience back in 1992, when I'd been working for John Major, was that the exit polls had indeed been incorrect. People had actually voted in an election, came out afterwards, and someone had said to them, a polling person had said, will you tell us how you voted? And they'd systematically lied. Interesting. So I wasn't convinced when I saw the exit polls that we would be in this very difficult scenario 4 experience. In fact, the exit polls were spot on. So we did get into this scenario, and it was with some trepidation that I made the preparations and went again to the Prime Minister and said, Prime Minister, will you authorize for the civil service to support the opposition parties in the process of facilitating a formation of a government? The Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, said yes. So all the politicians through this behaved, in my view, impeccably. Prime Minister said yes. So we facilitated the meeting of Conservatives with Liberal Democrats, Labour with Liberal Democrats. Some of the smaller parties asked for briefings. So we facilitated those sessions in that we provided rooms for them, and I would talk to them about the role the civil service could play, but if they, for example, asked for information, that we would make it equally available to everybody, so we weren't going to favour any one party, and our principle was to treat all parties equally. One of my objectives in this process was to maintain the political parties' trust in the civil service, whatever outcome finally emerged. Because one of those parties I knew would be in opposition, possibly 2 of them, and one will be in government. And we needed the trust of all of them to maintain our impartial system. So I did that. I also said to the parties when they came to get together and negotiate, do you want a civil servant in the room to record a record of what you've agreed? And they all said no, which was fine. I think they were quite nervous about the civil service, and it was quite proper for us to offer and quite proper for them to turn it down, and that was true of all of them. So we were merely facilitators, and the political parties did the hard work of negotiating. Were they going to have a minority government with the other parties supporting them on what we call a supply and confidence basis? That means they'd help them on certain areas but not others. Or were we going to have a full coalition? And was that coalition going to be one of 2 parties or many parties? In the end, the political parties decided that the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats would get together and have a full coalition. And I remembered at this point thinking that first impressions were very important. And they were very different because the Conservatives were a very big party, experience of being in government a lot. The Liberal Democrats had been a much smaller party in terms of votes and seats and very little experience of being in government. And you notice this when they came in for the talks. The first time we had the talks in the Cabinet Office, the Conservatives arrived in their cars and the Liberal Democrats walked to the building. And for once, the focus of the attention of our domestic media and some media around the world wasn't on Downing Street, where the Prime Minister was, but it was on the Cabinet Office. And I remember at that point thinking one of the best decisions I'd made in the previous year was to spend some money on painting the door of the Cabinet Office. So it looked fairly respectable. But the media took a lot of interest, camped outside our offices for about 5 days, and were following everybody that came in and out. We had some very interesting games where we had cars going in various different directions, some of them containing politicians, some of them containing other people, just to kind of put them, to keep the confidentiality of the process. So it was quite tough, but we facilitated it. I think throughout we kept the trust of the politicians. And another really important objective for the United Kingdom was that we did not allow the Queen to be dragged into politics. For us, it was very important that the sovereign remained above politics. So through this process, the Queen's principal private secretary came and sat with me in my office, and obviously it was important at some point the negotiations would get to a stage where the Prime Minister would go off to the Queen and say, Prime Minister, I can't form a government, and you should, and recommends who she should call on to form the next government. And that eventually happened. That process went smoothly, and so we went to transition. It was, when I look back on it, there were lots of lessons. Our preparations were important, but there are things we didn't get right. Also, it was a bit, when I look back on this, I think it was a bit like my own experience as a father when I went along with my my wife, to the classes for childbirth, and the hospital talked us through the whole process, and we were very prepared for the process of childbirth. The really scary part was when they gave you the baby and told you to go home, and you had no one there to ask, and it was, you know, when the baby cries, you think there's something wrong with it. When the baby doesn't cry, you think there's something wrong with it, and you have this crisis. Suddenly for us, when they formed the government and the Prime Minister, David Cameron, walked through number 10 and we clapped him into number 10 as is traditional, I think we all suddenly thought, what now? We had no blueprint of how to run a coalition government. We had come up with some suggestions with the political parties that we would manage the business through lots of cabinet committees where the chair of the committee would be from one party and the deputy chair would be from the other party. So we would, and the phrase I used, the verb I used was to coalitionize all of the policy, because we had no experience of this. The way the coalition operated, there were certain departments that had no minister from one of the parties, so we had to work out a way of making that happen. We came up with an idea that we would have a coalition committee that would meet once, twice, 3 times a week to manage crises, to manage conflicts between the parties. This turned out to be completely unnecessary. The actual conflicts were managed through the cabinet committee process and through the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, curiously enough, talking to each other and trusting each other. So we created some machinery that turned out to be redundant. That committee, coalition committee, met, I think, twice in the first 4 months. So it wasn't necessary. We created slightly different committees, but all in all, I think the process was for us a very learning process. The other thing I wanted to do was, obviously for the civil service, it was very new having a coalition government. How do we manage the priorities of the 2 different people? So I had created, during my time as Cabinet Secretary, a group that I called the Top 200. They were the top 200 civil servants, heads of agencies, the people throughout the civil service who were responsible for implementation of government decisions. And I wanted them to really work on how do we turn government's priorities into real everyday results on the ground for the people. And what I did was get the top 200 together and invite the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister to come along and explain their strategic priorities and what they wanted the civil service to deliver for them. And I think that was a very good thing to do at the start of a coalition. I think the even better thing was to have them come back a year later and for the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister to say, well, actually, the question I put to them was, tell us what we've done well and tell us what we've done badly. Tell us where we need to improve our game. What things are we not working well? And that process of dialogue, as mentioned, the importance of dialogue, I think has helped us to work with the democratically elected government to deliver better results for all concerned. To democracy. You have a very vibrant democracy. I'd like to wish you the very best of luck for your next election. I'm very confident, given your history, that it will be a very vibrant campaign and that it will achieve the corroboration of the international community that you've achieved so far. And I'd like to congratulate you on all you have achieved in your short time as a democracy and the successes you've achieved as a nation. Thank you.